time last, and that's what I went for.
The kind of big subculture was goth, wasn't it? And so,
Yeah.
and
Well, I had, believe it or not, full hair, and
yeah. Well, because indie hadn't really solidified, even though it was 1986 and there's the C86 cassette, but the C86 cassette was marking a new burgeoning movement, whereas you go to an alternative disco and it'd just be wall to wall Susie and the Banshees, Cure, Bauhaus, so there was
yeah.
the idea of indie music being something jangly didn't really exist. I don't even though you had C86, the vast majority of people
Yeah.
weren't listening or certainly dancing to that.
I guess it was the Smiths was the first sort of
Yeah,
mainstream jangly.
and they'd
Uh,
and that was 84, wasn't it?
and the sad thing was I didn't like them
Well, a
at the
lot of people
time.
didn't,
I loved them later
Yeah.
on, but it
And
took
then
me 2
probably have a
years to
bit of a
sort of
troubled relationship with them now. It's
yeah, yeah. We've gone full
yeah,
circle.
yeah. I mean, that's a particular rabbit hole I try and avoid
Yeah,
going down, but I find
yeah,
it fascinating. I absolutely love the Smiths, and
yeah.
yeah, my affection for them grew. I don't think I immediately got it when the first record came out, and then I remember hearing "How Soon Is Now" played out in the hacienda for the first time, and just going, "Oh my
Mm.
God, what is this?" And then I remember being back in a friend's bedroom, and it was my first year at university, and they were listening to the song, and they were just in floods of tears, and just going, "That is my life." That it was a gay friend of mine, and he just identified so strongly with the lyrics to "How Soon Is Now," and he just said, "That's my life."
Yeah. It's extraordinary, isn't it, when there's one you can identify the exact moment that you first heard a band and liked
Oh
them.
yeah,
Like even a band you didn't like before. With the Smiths, there was a South Bank show, I
yeah,
think, just as they released the last
absolutely,
album.
yeah, great show.
What was the last album called?
Strange Ways, Here We Come.
Strange Way. And just as the credits roll, I watched it with a friend. We're both, mad into music, and we sort of felt the same. And then the credits rolled. They played "Stop Me If You've Heard This One Before." Now, this is the greatest thing I've ever heard in my life. What have I been
Yeah.
thinking all this time? And this was my sort of absolute, road to Damascus thing. And then we became quite obsessively into the Smiths after that. Great.
I remember
It's
how
only
it
one song.
sounded though, but that the way because it just builds with that amazing arrangement, doesn't it? That sort of, I mean, that the production, Stephen Street's production, and obviously, but the musical side of the band between what Stephen and Johnny Marr were doing was just incredible, and obviously, arguably the greatest lyricist of his generation as well.
Yeah,
Delivering, amazing melodies and top lines.
yeah. Great stuff. Well, I might, I'm going to easily, it's going to be very hard for me to keep
Not at all.
on schedule.
I look forward
So I
to you
should just, I'm
editing this
normally,
into something you can actually use.
yeah. Yeah, I'm normally joined by Andrew, but he just phoned me just before we went to start, and apparently some cherry pickers taken out his internet in his
Oh,
remote village.
that's a shame.
So he was phoning to say he's got no internet. So
Whereabouts are you then?
we're both in Hertfordshire, but either side of it. I'm in St Albans,
Okay.
just it's half an hour into
Yeah.
London. So, I work in London, and it's good round here. But
Yeah, my
yeah.
friend Andy Saunders, who did that podcast, he lives in St Albans, so
Oh, really?
I'm very familiar
You
with
only,
it
you only
as a result.
you only do podcasts with people from St
Yeah, it
Albans.
makes
That's
life
nice.
a lot easier.
Great stuff. So, should we try and work through some of these?
Absolutely, yeah. I haven't got the questions. I looked at the questions you
Right.
sent over. The only one, I think you'd asked about what it was like signing Stormzy. I mean, I worked with Stormzy quite closely, but he'd been signed just before I arrived at Warner Chappell, so it might be more
Okay.
interesting to
Okay.
talk about Dave and the signing process with
Sure.
him.
Oh, okay, Dave. Cool. All right. Lovely stuff. So, should we start by you telling us who are you, where are you from, and what do you do?
My name is Mike Smith. I am originally from Birkenhead, which is a town across the water from Liverpool in Merseyside. And I am a retired, I guess, music industry professional. I talent scouted and did A&R and ran record and publishing companies for the best part of 35 years. And I'm now living in Spain, still helping people out as much as I can in the music industry, but trying to avoid the attentions of corporations these days.
Hmm. So, for the benefit of sort of people who don't know about the music industry, could you, sorry to ask you this, but could you briefly explain what is A&R and how does it differ from record companies and music publishing? They're three different sort of strands of the industry.
Yeah, A&R is artist and repertoire. So an A&R man, back in the day when that name was coined, would probably have been somebody who was familiar with a recording studio, but he would be responsible for finding the artist that the record company was going to work with, and he would then oversee the recording career of the artist within the record company. So back in those days, most artists, and we're talking about, the A&R originates going back, to the 30s, 40s. So it was quite rare for an artist to write their own songs. I mean, you probably had you had certain jazz artists, but even then, the majority of them did not write their own songs. But you had blues singers, and the blues singers were probably the ones that were self-contained singer-songwriters as such. But the vast majority of recording artists needed songs, so they needed repertoire, and that's where A&R comes from. The A&R man would go out, would find the artist, and then he would find the songs, the repertoire for them to sing. And that's what they did. And then he would probably go into the recording studio with the artist and make the recording with them that the record company would then go and sell. And the A&R person would be the conduit between the artist or the artist representatives, their managers, and the record company. So he'd be explaining what the record company wanted and, their demands and their requests to the artist. And then he'd be explaining the artist and what they would agree and not agree to back to the record company. So it's a great job because it's the closest you get to being an artist, being a pure creative within a record company, in my mind. Obviously, the marketing department will tell you it's all their fault, or the radio department will, or the video department will say if it wasn't for that video, it wasn't me. Likewise with the artwork, whatever. Everybody claims credit. But what I loved about the concept of doing A&R was that you were the one person in the record company, in theory, that decided your own fate. You went out, you found the talent. The talent wasn't given to you. You found it, you made the decision to sign it and work with it. And you had a big part to play in whether that artist was successful or not. And that really appealed to me. I hated I wasn't particularly thrilled about the idea of working in the music and being given a record I didn't like to work with. I wasn't. I was never of the opinion that all music's great. I just want to work with music. It was just like, actually, I don't think all music's great. There's an awful lot of music that I don't like, and I always had quite an evangelical attitude towards the music that I loved. I'd been listening to the charts ever since I had a radio. So, probably before I was 10 years old, and I was listening to it going, I like that song, don't like that, don't like that, I like that song. And I'd listen to the chart down. And there'd usually be about 25-30% of the songs that I liked, and then the rest I didn't like. And I dreamed of being able to get a job where I could actually find music that I loved and hopefully help that music to be successful and push out the music that I didn't like. I appreciate that's quite an arrogant stance, but that was the way I felt strongly about it.
So how did you get into A&R then? That was a story.
Well, I'd originally started managing my friends in bands in Manchester. I went to Manchester to college, and I had this somewhat naive notion that by getting to meet A&R people with these fantastic because I didn't really want to be a manager, but I wasn't particularly musical, so that was my one way of getting close to music and artists. I did want to be an A&R person. I wanted to meet A&R people, and by managing bands, I got to meet some A&R people, and I figured that they would see, God, this guy knows what he's talking about. He's managing some fantastic bands. Let's give him a job. That didn't happen, and I was in Manchester in 1987, and I figured, all the tapes, the demos of the bands I was working with, I was sending off to London. So it was obvious, if I wanted to get a job in the music industry, I needed to move to London. Ridiculously, I'd been offered a job working with Gareth Evans, who managed the Stone Roses. I mean, I didn't know it at the time. He was a guy that ran the International, the local music venue. But it's so funny to think that sort of like the first A&R decision I made was to leave Manchester just as it was about to become the epicenter of the musical world. But anyway, I moved to London, and I signed on, went on the dole. I've got to be honest, I wasn't really cut out for the kind of poverty and squat living that some of my friends were. So I signed up with every temping agency I could to get work, and I did every kind of work. Was a post boy for the post office, pension service. I worked at Unilever, were editing technical documents, literally crossing T's and dotting I's on the instructions to manufacture Lux toilet soap. I worked in the kitchens at Arthur Anderson's Accountants. And then one of the agencies that I'd signed up with, and I was applying to every music company going for a job, trying to get a job at Record and Tape Exchange, trying to get a job at Rough Trade, just trying to get a job anywhere. If I got an interview, it seldom led anywhere. And then I got a job. One of my agencies rang back and said, "Oh, there's a job going as a post boy at Universal." And I thought, well, at the time I was editing technical documents at Unilever, so I was delighted to get that job. And it turned out within Universal's building, which was at 139 Piccadilly up at Hyde Park Corner next to the Hard Rock Cafe at the time, within the building was a music publishing company called MCA Music. And my job as the job was so much more than just being a post boy. I was responsible for the security of the building, so I would unlock it in the morning, I would lock it up at night. And so I was so excited to discover there was a music publishing company. Not that I knew what a music publishing company was, but it was a company that had A&R people working in it, that had talent scouts working in there. And very quickly I discovered that music publishing companies exist alongside record companies. They don't sign, well, what they do is sign the person that writes the songs. Now, sometimes that can be an artist that writes their own material. And by the 80s, when I was working there, maybe even the majority of songwriters were performing their own material. But also there was a lot of professional songwriters that they picked up whose songs they pitched out to be recorded by other people. Plus they had a big catalogue of songs by artists, by writers that maybe weren't around anymore or were old, and these were old songs that they would be pitching out to people to get covers. So every night I would be locking up the building, but it gave me the opportunity after the people had left their offices to essentially go through their desks, their notes, and just really get to know what they did. And I talked to the A&R people, and I talked to the talent scout. I'm sure I was a complete pain in the arse. I've got no doubt the talent scout just thought, who is this new guy? He obviously wants my job. Get him away from me. But they were very tolerant, and from doing that, I went on. I made up my own little card, which I laminated and had Mike Smith, Talent Scout, MCA Music, using a bit of headed notepaper, and using that, I just went, oh my God, I can get into, because like most small venues are thrilled to get somebody from a record company or a music publishing company down there, because it means that, oh right, we're plugging into the major music business. They can say anybody's playing at the band. Oh, do a gig at my venue. We've got people from the music industry coming down here regularly. So I suddenly found I could get into gigs for free with, by blagging it. So I started doing that. I got to meet other talent scouts. I got to, I very nearly got myself in hot water, because there was a band I'd discovered called the Darling Buds that were a female led, guitar band from South Wales that I loved. The Primitives had just had a top 5 single with Crash, and I thought the Darling Buds were going to be the next artist in to do that. I always loved, Blondie when I was a teenager. So for me, this kind of music, I definitely felt was very close to my heart. So I rang them up, and they were obviously thrilled that somebody from MCA was calling them. And then they were ringing me back, and I was having conversations with them in the post room, and they were sending me singles, and then I was clearly getting out of my depth. And then one of the A&R managers, this is a month after I've been talking to them, gets to hear about the Darling Buds, because there's now quite a big buzz on them, rings up the manager, and the manager says, I've been talking to Mike Smith in your A&R team. And they go, Mike's not in our A&R team. He's in our post room. And so the manager was furious with me. The A&R people were furious with me. And I came very close to getting whacked. But luckily I didn't. And by a twist of fate, the A&R team that was in place, they had a big success with a band called Third Ground Attraction, who had a #1 single with a song called Perfect. And they were so excited by the success of Perfect, they decided, the 2 A&R people that had signed them decided to leave MCA and set up their own publishing company. So suddenly these 2 new A&R people came in. A chap called Nick Phillips came in to run the A&R team, and a guy called Paul Connolly came in to be head of A&R. And the talent scout that was left, so there was a vacancy for a talent scout. So I did everything I could. Every contact I knew in the business, I pleaded with them to speak to my, to these new A&R people. I'd be chasing around, persuading all the, the staff in the building, all the assistants and secretaries, tell them I'm good. I go out every night. I see gigs. And I think, they heard that I had a reputation for going out and seeing bands every night. And they could see that I was diligent when it came to getting the mail to New York and changing the toilet rolls and locking up the building. So they gave me a chance, and that was it. And
Amazing.
in August 1988, I got my chance to be a full-time talent scout.
Amazing.
So that's how I got in.
Well,
believe me,
well
getting
done.
out was a lot harder. Getting it. I mean, at the time, whilst that process was going on, I applied. I've got a lever arch file that thick, 3 inches thick, of letters of jobs that I applied for. And I just, my face did not fit. I wasn't a particularly cool guy. I was just passionate about music. And I had my best mate from university. He came down to London. He had an extra year at Manchester. So he came down when I got the job as a talent scout, and he got my job as a postboy. And he was from Southeast London. He was, it's the mid-80s. He looked totally cool. The whole mid-80s James Dean thing, flat top, leather jacket, 501s, robot shoes, just looked great. He came down, and we met up with another old friend of ours from Manchester, and she was working as a secretary over at WEA Records. And she said, oh, my boss is looking for a talent scout. My mate Ben, who'd come down, he'd seen what I was doing and going, oh, this looks like a really good job. So he goes along, sees her boss. Literally 2 weeks after he's come down and got my job as a talent scout, he's hired as a talent scout over at East West. So he just fitted into A&R. I mean, and rightfully so. His knowledge of music was brilliant, and that's how we bonded. That's why we were such good friends, because we just talked about music 24/7. He educated
Yeah.
me so much more, and he was a lot cooler than I was. He'd seen the Clash at Lewisham Odeon in I think 1978. I'd seen the Clash at the Colston Hall in Bristol in 1984 when it was just Paul Simonon and Joe Strummer. So he was much cooler than I was.
So, sorry, which company was it you got in
I
for
was
first?
working at
A&R?
MCA Publishing. No, MCA
MCA.
Music Publishing.
And how long did you do that for then?
So
Starting in 88?
yeah, I was a postboy in 87, got the job as a talent scout in 88, and I left at the end of 1991. And I was headhunted to go and work EMI Music Publishing. So I went for working at MCA Music Publishing, which, was, let's say, was mid-table. It was, second division music publishing, whereas EMI Publishing was top of the Premier League. It was fighting with Warner Chappell. It was either EMI or Warner Chappell who'd be the number one. So I went from working for a company that was a real battle to convince anyone to sign to, that didn't have the deepest of pockets to sign people with, to a company that everyone wanted to sign to and would always write the biggest check if you needed to. So my life, potentially, as long as I had good taste and made the right decisions, could get a lot easier, because there was the wherewithal and the willingness to sign artists that I loved.
So you were at EMI from 91 to
From the beginning of 92 to the end of 2005. So 14 years.
Wow. So that was most of your
Yeah, and
time was there with
I think my old man had stayed at the same company his entire life. I wasn't one of those people that jumped around. Certainly at that age, I wasn't one of those people that jumped around from job to job. All I ever wanted really was to run the A&R department at EMI Publishing. That was my dream job. I didn't have ambitions to go and run a record company. I didn't want to be, the boss of the publishing company. And then I eventually got to that position of head of A&R and decided, actually, I don't like this job. And it was that element again of having to embrace every shade of music, which obviously you have to do when you're doing one of those bigger jobs. And I was very lucky to be headhunted again and asked to run a record company. And that record company, Columbia Records, had a very clear musical brief. They wanted me to come in. They particularly liked the roster of artists that I worked with. They liked the fact that, my tastes were left of center, and they wanted me to build up a cool left of center, sort of like rock alternative based label, and I was able to persuade them to let me, work with dance and electronic artists. And that gave me a really good remit to sign some great music to a record company.
So in a sort of terms of what you were doing day to day, what was the biggest change when you switched from head of A&R to head of Columbia?
Well, they use live ammunition in a record company. It's the lovely thing at a music publishing company. I very occasionally signed professional songwriters. The vast majority of people I signed at a music publishing company recorded their own material. So I would sign an artist that recorded their own songs. So once I'd signed them, there wasn't, I would be hard pressed to damage their career by doing anything. I didn't have to do anything. The records would still get made as long as they had a record deal. My job as a music publisher was very much giving them, I hope, excellent careers advice and working really hard with our sync team to get their music into films, TV, advertisings, product placements, helping them to collaborate with other artists. I was a very hands-on music publisher. But at the end of the day, I didn't need to be. I could be a really hands-on music publisher. And if the band was good and had a good record company, whether I was hands-on or not, they'd make the records would be hits, money would flow in. You go to a record company, and I very quickly discovered if I wasn't picking up the phone and going, right, what are we doing today? Suddenly every decision I was involved with, the demos that were coming in, right, which of these demos are we going to take forward to record? Who are you going to record with? Who's the producer? Which is the recording studio? The toing and froing, the arguments over getting the song right, especially when you're at a major label. The big difference, I think, between a major label and an independent is a major label's very focused on getting songs onto Radio 1 at the time. That was the main outlet for music. So I'm working with the artists I've signed to come up with recordings that we feel confident we can get onto Radio 1. And, I would have opinions. I'd get involved in those conversations in publishing. But in records, it was just like, those were much more black and white decisions. So there was no sitting on the fence. You were engaged every step of the way. And not just on the recorded side. Running a label, I was overseeing decisions about artwork, about video, about how the campaign would roll out, whether we'd bring in outside radio and press and TV, or whether we'd use our own teams. Plus, I'm trying to make sure that the label stays on budget. I'm trying to make sure that my bosses are happy. I'm having to deal with an avalanche of incoming repertoire from America, which when I was running Columbia Records was new albums from these incredible heritage artists like Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, AC/DC, Neil Diamond, Barbra Streisand, Tony Bennett, plus incredible international artists like the Kings of Leon and the Foo Fighters. Plus we were signing great overseas artists like the Gossip and MGMT. So it was, a phenomenal time. I pinched myself to think that I got to work in the music business at that time. But having said that, it was also an incredibly challenging time to be at a record company because we were not making money like we'd been making money 5 or 6 years previously. Piracy had ripped through the industry. The unbundling of the album to digitally download on Apple had a massive effect. So instead of you having to buy Back in Black to listen to Hell's Bells and it costing you 15 quid, you now could just download it for a quid. So you had piracy, you had unbundling, and the supermarket chains were trying to sell albums for less than a fiver, as opposed to 12 to 15 pounds. So the flow of the income was massively drying up, and as a result of that, the record, I joined a record label that was had nearly 40 people in. Unfortunately, by the time I left, it was less than half that size.
When do you think then was the absolute peak, and when did it start to? What year did it sort of start to fall away?
I think it was peaking at the end of the 90s, and I think piracy. There's a fantastic book just come out entitled 1999, and that was the year that it all changed. Napster launched in 1999, and whilst the music industry, the MP3 had been around for a long time, and all the record companies had their own little digital teams working on how we're going to approach this new world, they still saw it in terms of we are going to sell high quality digital versions of our albums. They hadn't quite cottoned on that they'd been doing that for the previous 15, 20 years with CDs. But they just saw it, well, instead of a CD, we'll be selling a nice bundle of MP3s that people will want to buy. And it took an awful long time for people to realize that the way the public were going to consume music was totally different. It was no longer going to be about buying a product. it was going to be about seeing music as a utility in the way that they saw electricity and they saw water, and it was a long, long time before the business got their head around that. And the whole time I was there was very much about navigating the change towards this new business model from a very traditional business model. So I'm still trying to rinse as much as I can out of the old physical business model, selling CDs. I was one of the last labels that insisted upon doing vinyl versions of every record we made because I love vinyl, and I'd have huge arguments with the sales team, but I'd still managed to get 500 copies of every record we made, which are obviously worth a fortune now because it's interesting. Vinyl from
We've gone back again,
well,
haven't
yeah,
we? Yeah.
but interestingly, vinyl from the noughties is way more valuable than vinyl usually from the 90s or the 80s or the 70s because it was usually just made in a very limited edition of about 500 copies.
Yeah.
So,
Amazing.
yeah, I was very lucky.
You
But I at the same time that was going on, we were also having meetings with Daniel Ek and seeing what the future was going to look like. And I was so relieved having come in at a time when Sony, who I was working for, was really struggling to adapt to the new model and was trying to enforce digital rights management onto CDs, which was not a progressive approach to the situation. By the time I left I left Columbia in 2012, streaming was becoming well established, and it was, you could see that, the catastrophic valley in terms of profitability of the music industry was starting to bottom out. It probably bottomed out about 14, 15, but it was I felt a very creative time to be working, but a tough time because there wasn't lots of money.